Hello everybody. I hope this video finds you all happy and healthy and hopefully happily munching on some muscle meat. In this video, I wanted to review the debate that took place on Primal Edge Health channel yesterday between DYER and Ask Yourself. Now, truthfully, the stream was a tale of two debates. I only really want to talk about the first one because it happened first, and it would be too long. It would take too long to talk about both. And that was the debate that I found most challenging and thought-provoking, and I think most people would agree. So, without any further ado, let's get down to business. Isaac, ask yourself, the vegan in this case, what his intention was, as per usual, was to introduce this name the trait trick that I already debunked on my channel. And I asked Isaac to defend, which he declined, because he knows what time it is. And if he were a logically consistent and ethical person, instead of quote-unquote debunking what I said in front of his echo chamber, he would actually grace us with his presence on a stream, live stream, defending the points that I made against Name the Trait that had his buddy, Vegan Gains, stumped, not knowing what to say, and not being able to pass the Name the Trait test himself, trying to convince us that it's ethically okay, that it's morally okay to eat people simply because they're not sentient. Anyway, I don't want to talk about Name the Trait, but the offer to Isaac still stands if he wants to be an intellectually honest person and wants to keep using this trick, or he has to essentially prove that it's not a trick. But as things stand right now, Name the Trait is in the trash can. So before Isaac can unload this Name the Trait syllogism with all its premises and the eventual conclusion, he has to set the stage and get his opponent in the debate to admit that logical contradictions exist, and if you have a logical contradiction within your ethical framework is basically full of shit and unethical. And he didn't get to say all of this, but he's done it in other videos. He's used Name the Trait to basically argue that meat eaters have an inherent logical contradiction within their ethical framework, which means that they either go vegan and remain ethical or become ethical people, or they keep eating meat and keep living a lie, keep having an ethical framework that is inherently contradictory. It's self-refuting, right? Meaning that it's unethical, right? So he started by introducing, I guess you could call it a premise, something along the lines, if it's true, and I quote loosely, that X is ethical and at the same time it's true that X is unethical, that's a logical contradiction, which he later translates into, it's not okay within your logical framework, dear meat eater, to murder people, murdering people being the first X, but it is okay within your logical, or rather ethical framework, dear meat eater, to murder animals, which is the other X. Now, there are a lot of problems with that, namely the fact that X is not X, right? Because murdering people and eating animals are not the same thing. But he tries to, and I'm talking about Name the Trait, even though I said I wouldn't be, but he tries to bring, reduce humanity to this level of a sentient being, and then he reduces animals to the level of a sentient being too, which in his mind, well, they're one and the same, which makes people and animals one and the same, which is why X is X is X is X, right? So he tries to point this out as a logical contradiction within your ethical framework, which gives you two options, right? You could be ethically, you could be wrong because you're going to maintain this logical contradiction within your ethical framework. You're going to keep eating animals while saying it's not okay to kill people and eat people. Or you could go vegan, and he's done this before. So even though he didn't get to that point because J. Dyer didn't let him, that's essentially how the argument develops little by little. And I've covered it more in other videos. If you're interested, you could go check those out. So when he unloaded this, if it's true that X is ethical and it's at the same time true that X is unethical, when he started to present his argument, Jay wanted to, well, this was Tristan, but Jay picked up from that. He stopped him and said, well, let's talk about what ethics actually are. Let's define this ethical framework. Where do ethics come from? Let's talk about meta-ethics, which is what? A branch of ethics that, I'm reading from Wikipedia right now, you could go check it out, that seeks to understand the nature of ethical properties, statements, attitudes, and judgments. It's one of three branches of ethics generally studied by philosophers, the others being normative ethics and applied ethics. While normative ethics addresses such questions as what should I do, thus endorsing some ethical evaluations and rejecting others, meta-ethics addresses questions such as what is goodness? How can I tell what is good from what is bad? And I would add to that because it deals with the nature of ethical properties and evaluations, meta-ethics. It also asks the question, well, where do these ethics come from, right? And for deists or theists, such as J. Dyer or Tristan, that's God. For atheists, you derive ethics from logic. And we'll get to that maybe in just a second. But when Jay said he wanted to talk about meta-ethics, ask yourself, revolted basically, right? And said he wouldn't get dragged down to this meta-ethical debate, right? Like there was something wrong with that. And then Jay said to him, well, how do you divorce logic from ethics? They go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, right? And the example he gave, the explanation for why this is so, was the following. If you're in a debate with somebody and you're making logical points, you're speaking the truth, in other words, your opponent can either accept the truth and also speak the truth, right? Or they can reject your logic, thereby losing the debate, because once you reject logic, you cannot proceed to make logical points because you just rejected logic, you refuted yourself, you just lost the debate. Or you accept the logic and you speak the truth and you're an ethical person, or you, once again, you reject logic, meaning you're wrong, or worst case scenario, you're lying. In either case, whatever the case may be, you're wrong, meaning you're unethical. So there is an ethical imperative when debating logic, right? When talking about truth. And ask yourself, whenever he asks his opponents to concede a point, because he thinks he's being very logical, and a lot of the times he is, what he's saying is exactly that. There is a moral imperative, ethical imperative, for you to agree, to accept logic. And maybe 2 hours into the debate, he agreed. He actually said this, and J. Dyer called him out on it. But he seemed to be struggling with this idea, and even though he didn't really say this himself, maybe what he wanted to say was that yeah, we could talk about logic without meta-ethics. And I agree with this, even though he didn't say this. Because what the example that Jay gave dealt with normative ethics, or in other words, what should we do, right? Should I agree with the logic and speak the truth, right? Which is what anyone would say, anyone in their right mind would say, like, this is logical. You should concede that this is logic. You should agree. You should speak the truth, right? Or maybe, you know, if you want to reject logic, you lose the debate. So once again, this ethical imperative, it's a normative. It speaks about normative ethics. What should I do? How should I act to be ethical, right? Maybe that's where the confusion for ask yourself came from, and maybe that's what he meant to point out, that, but he didn't do this, obviously, that, yeah, logic is connected to, you can't speak of logic or have a logical debate without a normative ethical imperative, right? You should agree with logic. You should accept truth, which does not, however, imply meta-ethics, which is, well, what is the nature of ethics, right? What is the nature of being ethical? Where do ethics come from? Or how do we know what's ethical, right? What is good and what is bad? How do we determine that? Meta-ethics, talking about the ethicality, as Jay put it, of ethics. But Jay in the debate said this, and I quote, "This becomes a question of meta-ethics," speaking about Isaac's opening argument, "when you ask about the ethicality of the proposition itself." Now, I didn't quite understand that, or I think maybe it needed to be explained a little bit better. And I think if he went along with the argument for a while, this would have come out if he just, you know, agreed to go into Ask Yourselves realm for a moment and talk about maybe some of these contradictions, supposed contradictions. Because ultimately, the juncture that we would have gotten to is what I just talked about a while ago, or at the beginning of this video, which is how Ask Yourself uses Name the Trait, how he uses the fact that he could find a logical contradiction within your ethical framework to paint your ethical framework as unethical, right? So what he's doing is he's using this mechanism to show what is good and what is bad. Because if there's a logical contradiction within your ethical framework, well, we know that your ethical framework is no good. There's a flaw in your ethics, right? Meaning that you're unethical. And that's exactly what meta-ethics is. Meta-ethics, as per Wikipedia, addresses questions such as, what is goodness? So once again, if he points out a flaw in your ethical framework, he is using logic to demonstrate that your ethical framework is no good. Or if there is no logical contradictions, if you're logically consistent within your ethical framework, what that means, that's one way of defining goodness, what's ethically correct. So eventually, Ask Yourself, if allowed, would have ended up talking about meta-ethics anyway, proving Jay correct, that you cannot talk about, have a debate centered on logic that doesn't also involve ethics. And when you really think about what Ask Yourself's argument is, once again, as I stated in the beginning, it's this method that he uses logic to try to show that meat eaters are unethical. His own argument uses logic and connects it to normative ethics. Later on, using that, both of these, logic and normative ethics, and connecting them to meta-ethics. Once again, proving J. Dyer correct, that you cannot have these. You could disguise your intentions with words. You could use semantics. You could try not to say the obvious or what should be obvious. But ultimately, what you're doing, ask yourself, is using logic to prove whether someone's ethical or not. To prove what is ethical and what isn't ethical. Meta-ethics. To show what a person should or shouldn't do if they want to be ethical or if they want to remain unethical. Normative ethics. So your very own argument, and I wish J. Dyer would have let you hang yourself. Your own argument proves J. Dyer's point. Now, normally J. Dyer is a very good teacher, but, you only debate your equals, all others you teach, meaning even though we say you're schooling people in a debate, you're not really there to teach them, right? So I could kind of understand why he didn't expound on this point that he made, namely that, once again, and I quote, this becomes ask yourselves X equation, right? Dealing with logical contradictions. J. Dyer said with reference to that, this becomes a question of meta-ethics when you ask about the ethicality of the proposition itself. Right? Maybe that's what he meant. And he could have expounded on it. And I think had he done that and maybe become more of a teacher, less of a debater, he would have really explained and convinced the audience just how right he was. But that's not really his duty. That's not really his job. It's just the fact that most of us aren't trained in philosophy. We've never been forced to think about these things. All of a sudden, we get introduced to all these concepts, and there's a lot of the debate gets kind of messy. There's no moderation. People are talking over each other. It's really difficult to follow, basically, right? And so I think Jay could have, had he become more of a teacher instead of a debater, he would have made a much stronger case, but only because the audience is not as educated as he is. But anybody who really sits down and thinks about this logically and breaks it down and really listens to what's being said, they'll realize how J. Dyer schooled, ask yourself, in Philosophy 101, right? You cannot have a logical debate without getting not only ethics, but also epistemology involved. Well, how do we know what we know, right? So not only, just to recap, is ask yourselves, argumentative strategy directly linked, or does it not only directly link logic and normative ethics, how you should behave, right? If there's again a logical contradiction within your ethical system, well, maybe you shouldn't be eating meat. Maybe you should become vegan if you want to be ethical. Otherwise, you're unethical, right? Not only does it imply normative ethics, or what you should do, and what the consequences are if you don't, meaning you'll be unethical, it also defines, by means of logic, what goodness is. Or at the very least, it's an attempt to define what is ethical, which is exactly the field of meta-ethics. Something he said he did not want to talk about when J. Dyer brought it up from the very beginning. And the reason why he did is because, well, this is just what it is. When you talk logic and you really dig deep and you're having an ethical debate using logic, how can you sit there and deny the fact that you're using logic to have an ethical debate? How can you just be so smart, ask yourself, and so intelligent, and so fucking dumb at the same time. How does that work? Or are you just being dishonest? I'm not sure. So DYER clearly won this debate. Ask Yourself clearly is wrong, even though it may not have seemed very apparent because the whole thing was a big mess. And actually, it's Ask Yourself who is logically inconsistent and incoherent. But that is veganism in a nutshell, right? Vegans want to be ethical, but they reject logic. I mean, guys like Ask Yourself pretend to be logical and they want to make veganism philosophical when it's just an ideology, right? It starts with an idea and then we warp reality to try to fit that idea instead of arriving at the idea by being philosophers and seeking the truth, right? Huge difference. So they pretend to be philosophers when they're just slaves to their ideology. Maybe that's why Ask Yourself cannot see how these simple concepts relate. Maybe they're not so simple. Maybe that's why Ask Yourself cannot see how he's using logic to show what's ethical and what ethical behavior is. Once again, meta and normative ethics, or the other way around. Not only, maybe that's why he cannot see how he's completely contradicting himself, saying that he does not want to discuss meta ethics, or that even logic and ethics don't have to be they don't relate to one another in an ethical debate where he's using logic to show how his opponents are unethical. I'm not sure if he's so ideologically possessed that he just cannot see this simple truth. He rejects this truth. He just can't fathom how he could be wrong, which he is, or if he's just simply a dishonest person. I don't know. I'm not going to make that judgment, but he's dead wrong, that's for sure, and thus unethical. But going back to veganism, what veganism does is precisely what Ask Yourself is saying should be done, that there is no connection between logic and ethics, right? Because what the average vegan, quote unquote, ethical vegan does is get into their feelings because poor animals are getting eaten. And they think that them feeling something, from that you could derive ethics. You could derive an ethical system that's credible and legitimate, right? Just because of how they feel. When in reality, you actually need to be logical in order to be ethical. But they're completely illogical, pretending to be ethical at the same time. So they reject this connection between ethics, logic, and epistemology too, but that's a whole another conversation when it comes to, cherry picking studies and lying about statistics and what really goes on in the world of agriculture, for example. It really becomes apparent why they do what they do, and this is the mentality of the average ethical vegan, right? Ethics have nothing to do with logic. They come from how I feel, my fifis. And one last thing. If Ask Yourself wants to quiz a deist and test their ethical framework for consistency, if he is to be honest and precise, what he needs to do is accept that the deist or the theist, as in this case DYER's, ethical framework is different from Ask Yourself's ethical framework. So, no, Ask Yourself, you cannot frame the debate, or as I like to put it, fix the game so that you could actually win, because that's the only way you could win, by putting a deist to an atheist standard. What do I mean by that? Well, A theist or deist, somebody who believes in a higher power, believes that ethics come from above, if you will, God or a higher power. That's where ethics, morality, God is morality, right? God is logic. God is knowledge. God is all of those things. That's where all those things come from, right? That's their, agree or disagree, that is their ethical framework. The atheist, on the other hand, and this is funny and so ironic, uses logic to try to determine what's ethical, while at the same time trying to tell us, in this specific case, not all atheists are like this, obviously, trying to tell us that there's no connection between logic and ethics. How fucking dumb can you be? Such a highly functioning individual, can he really be that dumb, ask yourself, or is he just dishonest? Ask yourself. I don't know. But be that as it may, theists arrive at morality or their ethical framework differently from the atheist. So if you're going to quiz a theist on whether or not his ethical standards are consistent and logically consistent, you're going to have to step into their realm. Okay? So when they tell you that meta ethics are important to them, that logic and ethics are intertwined, and this is why, you have to judge them by that standard, not your own standard. So don't fix the game so that you could win. Put people up to your own standard, which is debatable, because you're trying to point out an inconsistency within their own moral framework, which is objective. Morals are objective, and your system is subjective. So you have to step out of your presuppositions, subjective moral standard, and try to understand where they're coming from and point out inconsistencies within their own. Not your. Don't put them up to your standard. Try to understand what morality is to them and point out inconsistencies within their ethical framework, instead of fixing the game so that you could win, right? So there are a lot of problems and flaws with ask yourselves ideology. I don't consider it a philosophy. And if you really pay attention and break it down, this became very apparent in this debate with DYER, even though the whole fucking thing was a mess, right? Right. Is there anything else I wanted to add? Probably, but as it tends to be the case, I probably forgot. Anyway, I'm not saying everything I said in this video is correct. I'm not saying that I didn't misspeak here and there. I'm not saying that I'm the smartest guy around. I mean, it took me listening to the debate like 3 or 4 times before it all clicked finally, right? But what I am saying is that if you disagree, well, the comment section is your friend. Just make sure you're logical and ethical, and you know what the fuck you're talking about. Thanks for listening.